Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Hutchins Center's Alum Fellows Reading Series. Today, we're excited that Mark Warren has returned to present his new book, Willful Defiance, The Movement to Dismantle the School-to-Prison Pipeline. And we're also honored that Bianca J. Baldridge has agreed to serve as discussant. She is Associate Professor of Education at the Harvard Graduate School of Education. Her recent prize-winning book, Reclaiming Community, Race and the Uncertain Future of Youth Work, examines how racialized market-based reforms undermine Black community-based organizations' efforts to support comprehensive youth development opportunities. Please welcome Dr. Baldridge.
Thank you so much for that introduction. Thank you for having me. I'd like to extend my gratitude to the Hutchins Center and to Dr. Warren for this invitation to join him in conversation about Willful Defiance. Just to share a little bit of information about Dr. Warren. Dr. Warren is a sociologist concerned with the revitalization of American democratic and community life. He studies efforts to strengthen institutions that anchor low-income communities, schools, churches, and other community-based organizations, and to build a broad-based alliance among these institutions and across race and social class. Mark studies and works with community and youth organizing groups seeking to promote equity and justice in education, community development, and civic engagement. He's committed to developing a new approach to scholarly work that is engaged and collaborative with practitioners and community and institutional leaders. Mark is the author of several books, including Fire in the Heart, How White Activists Embrace Racial Justice, Dry Bones Rattling, Community Building to Revitalize American Democracy. And I have followed Mark's career for a very long time, and he is a former community organizer and is deeply committed to making sure that young people are experiencing dignity and humanity in schools. And I'm really grateful to have this opportunity to engage with him about his book, Willful Defiance. Willful Defiance is a necessary history and necessary storytelling about the movement to dismantle the school-to-prison pipeline. The book examines the significance of local movements to social movement building on the national level towards disrupting the school-to-prison pipeline in ways that I believe prior scholarship has not. I am deeply moved by the stories of young people, parents, and activists who have been impacted by the school-to-prison pipeline, and I'm looking forward to engaging with Dr. Warren in dialogue with you all today.
Well, great. Thank you so much, Bianca, for that really nice introduction and for coming to engage with me today. And thank you to Krishna for inviting me. I am returning here. I was a fellow at the Hutchins Center when I started this project. So it's exciting now that the book is out to come back and share some of it with you all and have some conversation. As Bianca said, I consider myself a community engaged scholar, and this is a work of scholarship, this book, but I also consider it a resource for helping to strengthen and build a movement for educational justice. I did this book in deep partnership with community organizing groups working to dismantle the school-to-prison pipeline. And one of those groups, Sacramento Areas Youth Speaks, put together a spoken word video to pair with the book, because we believe that we have to engage people in different kinds of ways and multiple audiences if we're really ever going to create the change that we want to. So I wanted to share their spoken word video with you for a few minutes, and I hope you find it powerful as I do. So.
They don't care if our babies thrive at school, long as they get by at school. Get by institutionalized racism and intergenerational oppression systems that keep prison pipelines thriving. Disguised as willful defiance, I'm trying to understand why urban schools have the highest rates of incarceration instead of culturally relevant curriculum that should be liberation. Suspensions from school feel like eternity. Strategically guide the Black and brown kids out when we truly come to school to get free. Stifle academic and social emotional education. I'm just saying, could this be racially motivated? Outcomes being primarily Black and brown youth become academically stagnated, leading to suspensions, expulsions, less school participation, stereotypes perpetuated. Is your school pedagogy, discipline, or human elevation? Discipline data from the Department of Education found that Black girls are 5 times more likely than white girls to be suspended at least once from school. This data infuriated. When Black girls are 7 times more likely to receive multiple out-of-school suspensions, where is the healing, motivation, and rebuilding? How do we stand in our confidence after it has been disciplined away? How do I come to school ready to learn when you are trying to strip my intelligence and make it seem like I am insane? Black girls are 3 times more likely to receive referrals to law enforcement when white girls are getting away with behaving the same way. And we already know what they are doing to Black and brown boys. It's insane. Just check the data, it's been staying the same. I mean, steady increasing is definitely a shame. Do we want to teach Black boys or do we want to lead them away to trajectories that don't lead to school or higher education degrees? Schools act like they are paid to lead them to the police, when it's supposed to be a safe haven to keep youth off the streets. Expand opportunities, increase chances to succeed. Shouldn't school be focused on how to keep young people engaged and excited to be in their seats? Stop mistaking our pride for reasons for us to collide with suspensions, infractions, eventually leading to the police. We trying to dismantle the school-to-prison pipeline. It's definitely time for us to get free. Who their students are and the environment they are living in. What students have to go through when they go home and live through before they can make it back to school again. Have you taken the time out to comprehend the life experiences of the children you are teaching and how your experience greatly differs from them? We have to remember school can empower or be a major hindrance. Is your school pushing towards prison or the most beautiful existence? The difference is we fighting for educational justice. Trust us, we won't stop until our babies get free. Educational liberation means we have to fight for what we believe. You can't suspend the truth out of our youth. You can't expel a generation that's meant to prevail. We demand an education where we can be more than our ancestors' wildest dreams. We want to go to school and truly be free.
Can somebody explain to me why? As soon as we enter the room, the teacher says bye-bye. We not getting paid enough. Why should I care for kids that don't care for self? That's just one last brother we have to worry about getting well. Can somebody explain to me why young sisters is being suspended disproportionately, hand-bound and kicked out of school for throwing attention tantrums, sent out on Zoom for sending messages? Pipe down, little Black girl, you're too domineering. Pushed out, harshly disciplined, over-criminalized, school not made for a Black girl to shine. Can somebody explain to me why all my beautiful Black and brown faces sitting in courtrooms over classrooms, juvenile offenders, minor underage, facing life rather than graduating? Something is wrong with this country's education. We losing our babies, perpetuating racism in a system that's not set up for us to win. And parents don't send their kids to school, we criminalize them. It's clear to me education is not for liberation, it's for disciplining. Can somebody explain to me why officer on campus arresting teens, placing minor in custody? It's a shame we live in a nation that doesn't invest in education. Can somebody explain to me why being Black in school is a crime? My skin not willfully defiant, it's just a dirty trap to keep us trapped in the school-to-prison pipeline.
Okay, class, who would like to do problem 3 on the board? Please don't be me, please.
a little trouble there on the ending that video. Anyway, it's always a little difficult to follow that spoken word video, but I think that it expresses, I think, in some powerful ways what is actually going on in so many of our schools serving young people of color in this country. Krishna asked me to read some passages from my book, Willful Defiance. So I'm going to start off with the opening passage of the book and then read a couple of others, and then looking forward to the conversation with Bianca. So this chapter is called Confronting the School-to-Prison Pipeline, Journeys to Racial Justice Organizing. When Zakia Sakara Jabbar's 3-year-old African-American son was suspended from his pre-K program in Dayton, Ohio, she was shocked at first. The preschool kept calling her to say Amir was in trouble for biting other students or having difficulty transitioning from one activity to another. In Sakara Jabbar's view, quote, they made normal 3-year-old behavior sound very pathologized and abnormal. The school wanted to have her son evaluated. On the advice of her pediatrician, she refused. She worried that Amir would be unfairly labeled and that the label would stick with him throughout his schooling years. Eventually, under pressure from the school administration, she decided to withdraw her son from the school, but he was subsequently suspended and expelled from several other preschools. Sakara Jabbar had to drop out of college to care for her son, but before she did, she used the college library services to search for articles on the experience of Black boys in public education. And she quickly learned that her son's experiences were not unusual. Quote, I suddenly realized that I wasn't a bad parent and that my son wasn't abnormal. This was something larger, more societal that was happening to African-American parents. That's when I began organizing. She started talking to other Black parents, and many shared similar stories. Quote, I found out from other parents who had Black boys with the same behavior or personality as my son, kids who are energetic, who know what they want, who have strong personality traits, that they had the same experience. I was coming to the realization that schools are not working for Black children, regardless of whether they are urban, rural, or suburban. Sakara Jabbar reached out to Vernelia Randall, an African-American law professor at the University of Dayton. Together, they founded Racial Justice Now in Randall's living room in the fall of 2011, with the mission to address racially targeted punitive discipline and address the larger crisis in education for Black children. Randall gathered data on school discipline in public schools while Sakara Jabbar organized parents. The fledgling group joined the Dignity in Schools campaign, the national coalition of organizing and advocacy groups working to dismantle the school-to-prison pipeline. The Dignity in Schools campaign provided the new group with crucial support and resources, like a model alternative code of student conduct to replace zero-tolerance policies, and training opportunities for parents to learn how to advocate for policy change. In a few short years, with the assistance from the Dignity in Schools campaign and the powerful voice and leadership of Black parents on the ground, Racial Justice Now won a moratorium on pre-K suspensions in Dayton public schools, the first district in the state to do so, and changed the district's code of student conduct to end zero-tolerance policies. The group also won restorative justice programs in 8 schools, which featured an alternative approach that helps schools get at the root causes of issues rather than punish and suspend students. Continuing its work to support the education of Black boys, Racial Justice Now got the district to establish an office for males of color, modeled on a successful program pioneered in Oakland, California. They also issued school discipline report cards for 1,100 school districts across Ohio and became the key force behind passage of a state law banning suspensions and expulsions for students who commit minor infractions from pre-K through 3rd grade. Speaking proudly, Sakara Jabbar notes, a little volunteer group, Racial Justice Now, did all that. Nevertheless, this is just, in her view, this is just the beginning of what needs to be done to tackle a system where, quote, the abnormal has been normalized. Too many schools today will routinely suspend Black children, especially boys, label them failures, and send them down the road that eventually leads to prison and a life struggling with poverty. Quote, the Black community is in a state of crisis when it comes to education. I feel angry sometimes that there is not more outrage. We keep seeing this report and this data, but nobody is up in arms. We need to make some drastic changes right now. I want to jolt the consciousness of parents in our community to not accept the abnormal as normal. I interviewed Sakara Jabbar, when I interviewed Sakara Jabbar a few years later, she was still struggling with the school system and its impact on her son. Despite all the victories and changes that Racial Justice made, Amir, her son, was still coming home saying, quote, Mom, I'm bad. And Sakar Jabbar said, quote, Amir is in the 4th grade now, and this school year has been one of the most difficult. No matter what I do, I can't make the teacher see us differently. I can't make her see Amir as a little energetic 9-year-old boy who has seen some leadership qualities that if she could see it, she could cultivate instead of viewing him as a menace or a nuisance. I have tried to show my son's teacher that we are human. He has parents who love him and support him. He's not abnormal. He's not someone you should be afraid of, but I can't make a teacher love my son. So the next passage I want to read is from the preface of the book, talking about why we called it Willful Defiance. According to the California Education Code, section 48900, willful defiance is, quote, disrupting school activities or otherwise willfully defying the authority of supervisors, teachers, administrators, school officials, or other school personnel engaged in the performance of their duties. Every year, public schools suspend hundreds and thousands of students, mostly Black and brown students and those with disabilities, for behavior that is sometimes called, quote, willful defiance, unquote. Starting in the 1990s, state after state passed laws granting local school districts the authority to punish students for this kind of reason. Mississippi schools suspend students for, quote, disruptive behavior, and Louisiana for, quote, willful disobedience. In South Carolina, it is called, quote, disturbing school, and for many years was caused not just for suspension, but criminal penalty. It's a crime. So was, quote, acting in obnoxious behavior. In a widely publicized case in the state, Nia Kenny was charged with criminal, quote, disrupting school when she used her cell phone to capture a police officer violently dragging another Black girl from her desk and throwing her to the floor. Meanwhile, South Dakota bans, quote, boisterous behavior, while Arkansas prohibits, quote, annoying conduct. Maine makes interrupting a teacher by speaking loudly a civil offense punishable by up to a $500 fine. Suspensions for willful defiance or disruption make up a sizable proportion of all suspensions, and in many school districts, students are suspended for this reason more than any other. For example, in 2012, schools suspended over 250,000 students in California for willful defiance, representing well over half of all suspensions. As a broad and vague category, willful defiance and disruption relies on a subjective assessment by a teacher or school official, and is particularly subject to racial bias. Schools suspend students of color for, quote, willful defiance for a wide range of infractions, including talking back to teachers, refusing to take off a hoodie, or using a cell phone in class. Using willful defiance as the title of this book flips the script. It signifies defiance of school authority that serves to discipline and punish students and to push them out of school and into the juvenile and criminal justice system, the school-to-prison pipeline. When students and parents stand up to this kind of authority, they are consciously, intentionally challenging this system. As we will see in this book, when students rebel, they are often punished, while parents who stand up for their children are silenced, excluded, and sometimes even arrested. Community organizing groups bring parents and students together to move from individual acts of defiance to a collective movement to build the power to dismantle the school-to-prison pipeline. Gloria Warnham, a Black girl, now a woman, in Boston, tells this story that I believe perfectly captures the spirit and title of the book and the movement. Warnham was disciplined and suspended for challenging the type of history taught in her school's curriculum. She says, quote, I asked a lot of questions in school. For example, our history textbooks come from Texas. Is this really history, I would ask? And the teachers would tell me, you're being disruptive. Please go take a walk. I would get into fights and arguments, and I was suspended about 12 times. Once you're suspended for a fight, you're suspended for asking questions. I realized I was fighting the wrong way when I met a nonprofit organization that supports youth organizing called Youth on Board. They allowed me to be angry and to feel what I was feeling. I started positively struggling instead of negatively struggling. A lot of things need to be changed, and you're allowed to change it. Before, at school, everyone told me, no, don't do that. Be quiet, put your hand down. Then I went into an environment where people said, raise your hand, say something, reach out to someone, be part of something, do something. As a result of the organizing documented in this book, the movement to dismantle the school-to-prison pipeline has begun to roll back exclusionary discipline policies across the country. A coalition of organizing groups got the LA Unified School District to ban suspensions for willful defiance in 2013. The next year, the state of California banned suspensions for willful defiance for grades K through 3, and later extended it to K through 8. As a result of these and other changes, the number of out-of-school suspensions dropped 46% in California, while Los Angeles suspensions fell dramatically. In the 2007 and 8 school year, LA students lost 75,000 days due to out-of-school suspensions. 10 years later, that number had dropped to fewer than 5,600 days. Despite these gains in ending zero-tolerance approaches to discipline and more recent success in reducing police presence in schools, the school-to-prison pipeline remains deeply entrenched in our public education system. This book reveals the experiences of students and parents of color enmeshed in the school-to-prison pipeline and tells the story of the movement they have built to, quote, willfully defy and dismantle it. I think I have enough time to read one more passage. I'd like to read a little passage that talks about, that I talk about in the book about my journey in doing this kind of research. The experiences of Zakiya Sakkara-Jabbar and Gloria Warnham with the school-to-prison pipeline are unfortunately all too common. I heard story after story like these about school push-out as I conducted the research for this book. Stories of pain and trauma, but also stories of transformation through organizing and movement building. I wanted the voices of those most impacted by racial injustice to center this book, just as they ground the movement to end the school-to-prison pipeline. The personal stories I gathered and the experiences I witnessed serve to document systemic policies and practices that routinely push thousands of students of color out of school and onto the road to prison. While in Chicago, I learned that Chicago police had substations located in high schools where they arrested and booked children right in the school, sometimes leading them away in handcuffs. In Los Angeles, I met a Latino student who told me that the police would stop him at least once a week for riding his bicycle to and from school. Apparently, they assumed that a Latino teenager must be fleeing a crime or about to commit one. I learned that the Los Angeles School Police owned semi-automatic weapons and other military hardware, including a tank. So the LA School Police owned a tank. I discovered that many students, including young children, were literally brutalized by these racist policies. In Mississippi, for example, I met two sisters who had been incarcerated repeatedly in a juvenile detention facility where they were both physically abused. The so-called draining school was really a notorious jail, where students who were misbehaved were hogtied, like one of the sisters, were confined to a windowless, stifling cinder block cell with nothing but concrete floor to sleep on. When I traveled to the suburbs of Richmond, Virginia, I had one of the most disturbing experiences of my research in the field. I discovered while schools brutalized students, they often bullied parents who stood up for their children. I'd come to visit Advocates for Equity in Schools, a local organizing and advocacy group fighting racially discriminating school discipline policies with a special focus on students with special needs. The morning after I arrived, I was scheduled to interview their leaders, Candace Lucas and Lorraine Wright, but I received a call from them at 11 o'clock that night. They had to cancel our morning meeting because a distraught mother had just contacted them about a school security officer who had accosted her son outside his middle school that day. They invited me to join them as they accompanied the mother to a meeting at the school the next day. I sat there in shock and anger as the mother recalled what happened. Her African-American son had an IEB, which is an individualized education plan, that specified he could take a break from class and get some fresh air out on the school grounds if he needed to. When he took a break that day, however, a security officer followed him outside, handcuffed him, and dragged him along the ground. The school sent him home where he arrived with his clothes full of mud from the assault all the way down into his underwear. The mom said the vice principal called and told her to keep him home for a few days. He wasn't suspended, an action that would have created a written record, but she was told to keep him home nonetheless. At the meeting, the mom faced an array of impassive school and district officials. They had just watched the video taken of the incident, but refused to show the video to the mother. Although they did agree that handcuffing was wrong, none of the staff seemed to care that a child had been abused. No one apologized or offered to do anything to help. At one point, the administrator got from her seat and said she had to leave because, quote, some of us actually have to work, unquote. The mother had, in fact, taken off from her job to attend the meeting. In the end, the mother felt she had to accept the $300 the district offered to replace the young man's damaged clothes in exchange for her agreement not to pursue any further claims. To be honest, I was traumatized by hearing these stories and witnessing this kind of brutality towards Black and brown young people and their families again and again over the 3-year period of my research. I was deeply disturbed and emotionally wounded, even as I was able to return to my relatively privileged life. I hope that through this book, readers will gain an appreciation for the deep trauma experienced by families who are directly impacted by violence and injustice and its lasting impact on our lives. I spend time in chapter 1 to demonstrate that these stories are not exceptional, rather they are common. In that chapter, I systematically describe the operations of the school-to-prison pipeline as part of the larger system of mass criminalization of people of color, especially African Americans. I provide the data that demonstrate its racist nature and harmful impacts. I believe, however, that its personal stories are critically important for people to hear. Poor Black people and people of color have been silenced in this country. So one purpose of this book is to provide at least one place where people most impacted by injustice can speak their truth. Thank you.
Wow. Thank you, Mark, for reading those passages. As you can all hear, this book is extraordinary and just really spotlights the voices of parents and of young people, story after story. And I want to make sure that we do have time for questions from the audience, but I do have some questions that I'd like to talk with Mark about. And I think the first one that's really on my heart, especially given some of the examples that you read, I think as people read this book, you will understand and see, right, how many incidents of Black and brown people being harmed at the hands of police officers in schools, by school security or administrators, everything from teachers physically assaulting students, being locked in closets as a form of punishment, getting arrested for responding to racist harm, or being expelled for eating lunch during the wrong period. And as Mark just read for us, asking questions, challenging curriculum, asking for dignity in school spaces. And so when I think about these incidents, and as someone who also is engaged in community research, community engaged research, I sometimes struggle to believe that schools are redeemable. And given your personal background as an organizer, as a parent, you write about in the book your experiences as a parent of Black children, and your research, what possibility do you see for change, for transformation, and how did this book sort of restore hope for you, and how do you maintain hope?
Wow, that's a great question. As you can see, I get fairly emotional even reading my own book, because it also brings me back to those stories and those people and those situations. And I do believe it's important for people to feel. I think, statistics are important, but I think, we have to feel this emotionally to understand what really is, not just what's going on, but what can change. And so, I do believe that education is a human endeavor. We have unfortunately narrowed it through standardized testing and this discipline and control apparatus. But at its core, I think that what brings people to education is the possibilities and hope for full human development and freedom and liberation. And but I think what's going to take to do that, and the reason I wrote the book, is that I think we have to start looking for the possibilities and the answers to transforming our schools in communities of color, amongst parents and young people. And too often, I spent many years where you are at the Harvard Graduate School of Education. I spent a lot of time with educators and education researchers and policymakers. And too often, the paradigm is that, experts who are researchers, can develop policies that are supposed to work, and they inform policymakers and administrators, and then those reforms are then imposed down on schools and communities. And they have only served to reinforce the reproduction of racial and class inequality. And there's a deep-seated, what we often call deficit notions, but basic racist, stereotypes and narratives of communities of color. And, in my view, and the reason I wrote this book is, why are we spending all of our time looking at the weaknesses and the problems and dysfunction in communities and not asking the question, how is it that the African American community has been able to survive, nurture its children so that they can survive and thrive through 400 years of white supremacy? What could we learn from those parents and those young people and those communities that would be the basis for a system of public education that can really empower and serve students of color? And I think if we start asking that question, then I think we have a basis and hope for transformation. And I hope that this book it's not only about the school-to-prison pipeline, it's an entryway into a larger conversation about what is our system of public education, how is it based on white supremacy? And if we really understand that and believe that, then where do we need to look for new approaches and new answers to move our schools towards racial equity and educational justice?
Yeah, absolutely. I agree with you. I agree with you there. And I think what you said about sort of the ways in which communities of color are often pathologized, right? Parents are often pathologized for their approaches to parenting. Young people are pathologized for their responses to structural inequality. And I'm often ask myself the question and ask my students questions about who benefits from the narrative, right? That communities of color are, having wrong responses, right? Or to structural inequality. And I want to actually go back to where you began reading and thinking about the advocacy of parents and the organizing of parents in connection with young people and organizers and activists. But I really appreciated the way that you lift up Holmes County, Mississippi in particular. And historically, you talk about the significance to the civil rights movement and organizing in particular in Mississippi, and the labor and persistence and dedication of Black families, right? And in particular, Black women. Can you speak to the significance of this part of the history of dismantling the school-to-prison pipeline and its connection to other movements towards justice?
Yes, yes. So I'm not sure if I read some sections of the book, but when the history of the movement starts in the book, it starts in Holmes County, Mississippi in the mid-1990s. And, I think it's very significant that the first people to name the school-to-prison pipeline and to challenge it were not researchers, were not educators, we're not policymakers, we're not even the traditional civil rights community in Washington who were ignoring it at the time. It was African-American parents, families, and communities in places like Holmes County, Mississippi, in the heart of the slave system, but also a place that was very important to the civil rights movement, as I think you're referencing. And so in any case, there were various famous cases there where children were throwing popcorn at each other in a bus, and the popcorn hit the back of the white school bus driver, and she drove the bus straight to the police station, and 7 Black boys were arrested and charged with criminal assault because popcorn hit the head of the white school bus driver. And there was one of the first organizing candidates, and they named what they called it at the time was the schoolhouse to jailhouse track. That was a term really that Black families were using at that time, and it became the school-to-prison pipeline. But they drew immediately the connection between the criminalization of young people in schools and their entry into the juvenile criminal justice system. And so I do think it's very important that for any of us who are in the elite sector, who think that we are the ones who come up with the analyses, and we wouldn't even be talking about the school-to-prison pipeline today if it was not for the organizing work that Black and brown parents did. Now, bigger alliances were built. Researchers and educators did come into this space and play an important role, right? So we need these broader alliances. But we only got to that point because people on the ground were speaking truth about their own experience. And not just, we often say, oh, they're telling their stories. They had an analysis. I have watched a film that was made, where the African-American organizers, they had a map up of the state of Mississippi, was showing you where the prisons were built and how they aligned with scores on 3rd grade reading tests. that they were building prisons in places that had the lowest scores on the third grade reading test. And they laid out the whole analysis. So, and then speaking to your question, what they were building upon was, the very rich organizing tradition that has emerged in this country, in the South, and other ways too, but anchored in the South. And Holmes County was an important part, and I won't get into the whole history, but it was a county in which Black people had owned more land than in other places, and therefore had somewhat more independence from the white power structure, and could help support an early fledgling movement for that reasons. And in fact, the Nolly Jenkins Family Center, the organizing group, their first office was in the former offices, or what were still actually the offices of the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party. So it builds directly on that tradition. And I think a lot of, and its intergenerational nature, which you mentioned, I think is absolutely critical. This is an intergenerational movement, and that has been something that has really also grown out of the African-American experience and organizing experience. So, yeah.
Thank you for that. I think your book is really masterful at really acknowledging that part of the history, right? That it's young people, that it's parents that are doing the analysis. And it's a really, I think, great way, a great model for someone in the academy, right? To acknowledge that, because that's not often what's expected, I think. And so I was really grateful for that part of your book. I'm definitely watching time. I think connected to what you were just speaking about in terms of the intergenerational community organizing that has taken place and that continues to take place. And I want to bring us to 2020 and thinking about the uprisings after the murders of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, Tony McDade, and so many others. You talk about in the book, there's momentum built around the campaign for police-free schools. And you mentioned Minneapolis and Denver and Portland, who canceled their contracts with police departments. Previously, I was on the faculty at UW-Madison, and I witnessed in Madison community organizations and young people and parents who relentlessly fought for cops' removals from school. And, as we're sort of watching this happening in 2020, and giving your history and analysis of the movement, I'm wondering if you can share a little bit more about your thoughts on intergenerational community organizing against the school-to-prison pipeline, and in particular, the power of young people's involvement in the movement. And then you also sort of speak to, in the book, community organizations sharing resources, sharing knowledge. And I'm wondering if you could speak to that a little bit more.
Sure. I also want to say that, someone dropped a message to me about the experiences of Native and Indigenous children with the school-to-prison pipeline. And although I will say a weakness of the book is it doesn't feature that story very much, hasn't been that connected up. Certainly Native families and children are also disproportionately impacted by criminalization, by discipline policies and policing in their schools too. And so that's an additional conversation that we can have. And there are efforts to connect up some of the resistance movements that have happened in Native and Indigenous communities with this larger movement, which has been driven more by Black and Latinx families and communities. In any case, yes. So, I think for a lot of people, all of a sudden the police-free schools movement emerged out of nowhere, in response, out of the wake of the protests against police violence. And most people don't understand that there's actually was 10 or even more years of organizing around policing issues in schools. And, a lot of, really going back to the early 2000s, a lot of young people were saying, police are not making us safe. They are criminalizing us. We see police as the problem. Our schools are like jails. And of course, there's also a discussion of the school-to-prison nexus, which in any case we can get into. But in any case, it's really been at least 10 years. But the Black Organizing Project in 2012, which is an organizing group in Oakland, declared their goal of removing police from schools entirely within 10 years. People said they're crazy. Well, 10 years later, there are no police in Oakland schools. So we're also talking about hope here and possibilities of change. But in any case, there's been a lot of organizing going on, at least starting in 2012, even earlier, but with the Black Organizing Project. And then I did refer to this case in South Carolina where Nye Kenny was arrested for quote unquote disrupting school because she filmed an assault on a Black girl, Shakara, in Spring Valley. That was a seminal moment of the coming together, and the Alliance for Educational Justice launched a #AssaultAt campaign. In any case, what I'm trying to suggest is there's a lot of organizing going on. Hadn't necessarily won any victories, but when the mass protests came, most of the places where you saw the removal of police from schools or significant defunding were places where the organizing groups had laid the basis for that. So they had developed the campaigns, youth leadership, have been doing political education around it, had policy proposals that had actually already been submitted and hadn't been successful yet, but they had written policies, and they'd done relationship building and lobbying with elected officials. And again, it hadn't gotten to that point. But I think it's important to understand the role of, mass protest is absolutely critical, but often doesn't create policy change on its own. And I think the organizing work, and in this part of the School to Prison Pipeline movement has been led by young people. Parents have played an important role, but there's also been a lot of work with parents because, parents are worried about safety and some may believe that police are necessary. And so this is a case where I think the cutting edge role of young people at the forefront of the movement. I mean, we can go back to the civil rights movement and talk about young people being at the forefront of that. We can go back to, what were the age of Black folks who escaped from slavery? What age were they? Most of them were, I believe, studies between the ages of 13 and 27. They were young people. So, young people have always been played a very important role at the cutting edge of these movements. But I think that, again, they're not going to win victories on their own. And so I think the intergenerational nature of this is also very important. And we have a lot of now Black parent organizing, brown parent organizing groups, and I think even in Native communities who are saying, no, we also want police out of schools. We don't believe they're making our children safe.
Absolutely. I know that I see a hand already. I just have one quick question, and then maybe you can think about answering this however you want. But I'm just particularly drawn to the participant who said that she's angry about why there's not more outrage. And I'm wondering, after people read this book, how do you want them to think differently about the School to Prison Pipeline and the movement to dismantle it? And then what do you want them to do? And so that's my final question to you. And then I know that people have questions for you. So that's my final question for you.
Yeah. Well, I do hope that the book incites anger at injustice amongst people. And even, I think that story of Zacchaeus, people even in communities who are being, systematically oppressed by these systems can also, feel like nothing can be done or can internalize situations. Like even Zacchaeus saying, I thought we were the problem because you're made to feel like you're the problem, right? So there's got to be a transformation on lots of levels. But also, this is a book. So this is a book that's meant to be, I hope, useful. I did, for example, with the Black and Brown Parent Organizing Group in South LA. We went with the book. We did an out loud reading of the book with parents who don't often read books, and so we wanted to make the work accessible and useful to them. So it's a book that's pitched at a lot of audiences. But if we're speaking here, to a larger public audience, I do hope that people understand they're angry at the injustice, but also analytically understand that this is not just a set of misguided policies. This is really a deep-rooted system, and it's connected to the mass incarceration that's been going on, the new Jim Crow, as Michelle Alexander called. You cannot understand the School to Prison Pipeline when not seeing it as part of the larger, in a way, response to the gains of the civil rights movement, the desegregation of our schools. So now the answer is we're going to criminalize people, we're going to discipline and punish, particularly in African-American communities. And I think people need to understand that. They need to hopefully be angry about it as well. And then I hope people then also take the lesson of, well, we actually need to be listening and learning from African-American and Latinx communities who are struggling, not telling them what should be done, but actually listening to them and redesigning. And so, well, first of all, supporting policies, because things like removing police from school or defunding police systems need public support. Right? It's not going to happen only with the demand. So I think I wanted people to be listening to these stories, reading this analysis, and wherever they stand. The School to Prison Pipeline is, and you mentioned this before, it's anchoring a system that's providing a privileged education for many whiter and affluent people. That's just what's going on here. And it's a system that really needs to be transformed. People say equity is important to them. They say Black Lives Matter. Well, I hope it's a call for people to say, well, what am I doing about it? In whatever situation I am in. And certainly if you're an educator or in the education policy world, I really wanted to reorient you to be really being thinking differently and looking differently for answers. So yeah, so those are some thoughts.
Thank you so much for your work, Mark.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. We have a question from an alum fellow, Dylan Hubbard.
I think you're muted.
I think you have to unmute yourself.
Hello, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yeah.
Hi, I enjoyed the discussion and the reading, and it's right on time. I'm from Baltimore. I retired from Morgan State University, and so yes, we've seen some of this here in Baltimore over the years. What they call them, school resource officers, and they forget they should be a resource. Yes, this whole issue and the challenge, and we know that many of our young Black children at the 3rd and 4th grade, many of them are doing fine, but after that, too many of them sort of fall off the edge of the earth, and they can never, get back. And that's what we did at Morgan State, was turn around many of them as we could. I would like to come at this from a slightly different angle. I taught at the University of Tennessee and the University of Georgia before coming to Baltimore. And in my upper level classes, most of the students tended to be white women. So near the end, about the last third of the course, I would just talk to them straight, no chase, if I could use that phraseology, keeping it real. In other words, I would just say to these white women, and you call it a come to Jesus moment in the class, and I mean that with utmost seriousness, that when you get out into the school and teaching, you have to realize that these are young Black men, boys coming into their maturity, and they're going through puberty, and your first step should not be to want to walk backwards and go to the principal and say, help me, save me. I said, it is your responsibility to be some tough love, but to be kind and nice, but really do not take that step backwards. You are the person in charge. And then I would share with them, when I look back at my elementary school in North Carolina, they quote then colored school, how those Black teachers expected us to be our very best. And I would run it down. I would say, if the group that I was in, 5 to 7, I guess we would be considered what? Gifted and talented. But I said those other students, for example, we had one man in there, boy could not say the word 6. It would end up with S-H-I-T. But you could not laugh at him, because those teachers said when we had our, convocations, recitations, they might give us 3 paragraphs or a page to remember. But for someone like him, if he could only say C-spot run, he had to say C-spot run as though his name was the future James Earl Jones. And that's how I would try to get to my students to understand. you have to challenge these students to be their best and do their best. And I think that's another thing that sometimes get lost, that people don't expect our students to give their best. And the last point I would make, and many of us have done this as teachers, as students at the beginning of the fall, tell me how you spent your summer. Just want to see who can think. And I will see in a class, maybe 25, there'll be one or two, they're way up there. And I tell them their A in my class is going to be higher, going to be graded on a higher level. And then they will twinkle in the eye and they say, yes, teachers have told me this. And I said, then why are you coasting on it? I said, Frederick Douglass needs you. Harriet Tubman needs you. Martin Luther King, Jesse Jackson, we all need you. You are not going to coast. And then I see them sometime a few years later and they thank me for what I did to them. So we have to demand the best from them. They cannot coast. Thank you.
Yeah, well, thank you for sharing that. I don't know. I'm not sure if there's a question there, but I think that, you know, you are targeting and highlighting something that I think is also broken in our system, which is that, you know, too many of our teachers are coming from, white teachers from outside of communities and don't come with relationships and deep respect for families and young people. And so therefore either fear and want to back up, as you say, or paternalize and don't expect the best because there's not a mutual understanding and respect. And I think we can, demand the best of our children when we respect them. And that, that's what parents do, because they respect, they know their children, they see the potential, they love the potential, and they want to promote that. And so I think that's one of the deep challenges that we have. And I often say that one of the problems with our teacher education system is that we never teach relationship building. We teach curriculum, pedagogy. What we don't really teach, how do you really build respectful relationships with your students and their families and their communities, and how do you really come to understand them? Because the majority of our teachers are white and continue to be white, even teach, unfortunately, we need more teachers of color. But, on the other hand, I think we also have to hold out the hope. I mean, I'm a white person. I have my flaws too, and I have the journey that I'm on to be, better at what I do. But I also feel like there's a possibility for transformation that everybody has, and that we have to find ways to demand that and also nurture that.
Thank you. Virginia Downing.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Dr. Warren, for your talk and sharing about your book. I'm curious, you named, that there's that public support is needed in these efforts that we are trying, or that movements are trying to move through. And I was curious if in your book you talk about what that public support looks like and like who's kind of in that support group.
Yeah. No, I think it's a good question. I think in the book, it's usually pretty context specific to, organizing campaigns, whether it's in Mississippi, in Los Angeles, in Chicago, the different kind of places that I journey through and try to, document. So I think it does appear somewhat differently in different places. But, I think that one of the findings of the book, if you will, is actually the power of personal story and testimony has on moving people. And so, it's also an interesting story. 20 years ago when this movement started, and many of the organizing groups were working, Black parents and students and Latinx, wanted to name race. They said, well, this is racist. And, it was a time when the foundation world, don't say that. You're not going to win when you say that. When someone might even remember that when Obama was elected, there was actually even a discussion of whether we're in a post-racial America. Like, it wasn't supposed to be the time. Don't lead with racism. That's not going to work. And, you know, a lot of folks, and particularly this movement was path-breaking. In this movement, people said, no, we're going to lead with our truth as we see it. And it turns out that leading with that truth does transform and win over public support. Not only, I think statistics matter too. People have to understand that this isn't an unusual story. This is part of a broad pattern that's going on. And then also they need a variety of people who maybe look more like them to reassure them that this is right. Whether that's right or not, that's reality. And so I think the larger alliances where, you know, if we're talking about white people here, or white civil rights advocates and others, you know, also come on board in the movement and play their role to advocate in this larger public arena. So I do think that in terms of what really moves people for public support, and I think protests do as well. We saw that with the mass protests. So the combination in which these groups have also done. So I think combinations of, you know, personal stories, protest, demonstrating the systematic nature of this, building larger alliances that bring a lot of different people and resources to the table. Also, you know, starting to create some, you know, alternatives that show people that it can work. I think there's a number of pieces to this puzzle. It's not one silver bullet that's really going to change things, but I think these are all very important. And I do lift up this aspect because I think people don't fully understand. I mean, maybe now it's more accepted that people who are most impacted should be at the table, but 25 years ago, that really wasn't in much public discourse, whether anywhere in the policymaking or education world, even though it should have been, but it wasn't. And I think now, you know, due to the work of not just people in the School-to-Prison Pipeline movement, but other people, but I think there was some leadership there and spillover from that movement. One of the founders of Black Lives Matter was trained as a youth organizer in the School-to-Prison Pipeline movement. So, you know, there are definitely, you know, direct personal connections.
Thank you very much, Mark and Professor Baldridge. I do hope that the book will accomplish many of the things you hope for.
I think there's one question, Krishna. Sorry to interrupt. Yes.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
My question is, can schools narrow the black-white test score gap? And this was one of my professors, Ronald F. Ferguson, wrote a chapter on that. I think he's at the Kennedy School.
Yes. Well, I have a kind of couple of answers to that question. First of all, I don't think that the goal should be described. I don't think our primary goal should be described as narrowing the black-white test score gap for a lot of reasons, including that I don't think test scores are a good measure of educational success. And I also believe it's centering a kind of white experience as the norm that other people have to achieve in comparison to. However, so this is a longer conversation, but I do believe it's important to point some of these things out. And but at the same time, if you're saying, you know, can the education of our young people in African-American communities be improved, then the answer is absolutely yes. And, you know, we have done that. There were periods, and even on a broad scale and not having to take too radical approach to this, we could look at the 70s and 80s at a time when educational, even by very standard measures, was improving for African-American children. And then there was the rollback and the pushback against many of those gains and the cutting of our social programs, the cutting of funding and education in low-income communities, the rise of this, you know, kind of neoliberal agenda in education, the establishment of mass incarceration in the school-to-prison pipeline. So I think there's a historical story here, and it is important for people to understand that the gains of the civil rights movement really mattered. And, you know, for a lot of reasons, including the education of African-American and Latinx children as well. So I feel like that's another reason why we hold out hope. We understand that there's possibilities, even if we want to have a more radical imagining of what, you know, education can look like in this country. Thank you for that question.
Thank you. I think our executive director, Abby Wolf, has a few comments or questions.
I wanted to just close things out by thanking you, Mark, for coming back to us. It's a pleasure to see you again and to be so moved by you. I mean, your presence here on the screen brought it all back. What a powerful and unique presence you are, or were, as a fellow at the Hutchins Center. Dr. Baldridge, thank you for joining us too. I hope you'll come back. I guess just in closing, what I took from what you were speaking about so powerfully was that too much time has been spent telling the wrong stories and looking in the wrong places for solutions. And you are issuing a powerful call that we have to look to organizers, to the to communities themselves for answers, that we have to look for the proper partners in all of this, that the alliances that have been built before are not sufficient to what needs to be done. So thank you so much for your powerful work. And I know that we're all going to live with this for a while. Your words will live with us for some time. So thank you so much for being with us today.
Well, thank you so much for having me, and Bianca for spending your time and sharing your thoughts with us too is really important. And I think that this is the kind of conversation that we need, or one of them, if we want to move forward. And I will say this is an unusual event for me, because I almost never speak about this book alone. And because I also feel it's important for the people who are doing the work on the ground to have their own voice and participation. So it's fine, I enjoyed this, and I have done it before, but I also just want to mention that I think the more that we can create opportunities where people are directly heard is important, because I do spend a lot of time thinking about accountability, my accountability to communities as a white person who doesn't come from those communities, lifting up people's stories and voices. I try very hard to do that in authentic ways, and I think people partner with me because they believe I do that. Nevertheless, it is me doing it, and we do have to have these opportunities for people to speak for themselves and engage directly and share. So maybe we'll do a future event where some of that can happen. But thank you so much for having me today.
Thanks for your work, Mark.
Yeah.
Please get the book.
Yes, thank you.